Is tone really in the fingers? Well, kind of. So since the dawn of time, you've probably heard guitar players, especially famous ones, say, tone is in the fingers. And while I understand that there's definitely some merit to this saying, I don't think it's completely accurate, and I do think it's a bit misleading. So first of all, when a guitarist says tone is in the fingers, what are they talking about? Well, I think what they mean is you can't sound like any other guitar player unless you play the way they play, and it's very hard to copy the DNA of another guitar player, but it's fun to try. So if you're interested in learning how to play like Eddie Van Halen or Yoga Itchy Spleen, check out the link in the description below. I was listening to a Steve Lukather interview recently, and he talked about when he played Jeff Beck's guitar and he sounded nothing like Jeff Beck. And I remember a great story about Nuno Bettencourt when he went to a Van Halen rehearsal and he got to try out Eddie's gear, and he was so disappointed because he sounded just like himself. Personally, I feel like this saying is kind of aimed at guitarists who buy too much gear, but they don't do the practice. But if the saying tone is in the fingers was completely true, then we'd probably all just use the same gear and we'd be trying to use our fingers to emulate the sounds of our heroes. Now, anybody who's tried to learn Pantera songs while using a Fender practice amp knows what I'm talking about. It just doesn't respond the way you need it to reproduce those Dimebag squeals. And I think that's where the saying tone is in the fingers is really missing out. Personally, in my experience, there's two ingredients. And while this saying suggests that it's only your fingers stopping you from getting the tone you want, I think it's very important that we account for the other half, which is, of course, the gear you're using. Because if you naively pursue the tone is in the fingers thing, it will serve you well for a while and hopefully it'll help you extract the most out of your instrument. But it's not going to get you all the way there. You're probably going to have to do some research in understanding guitars and amplifiers and pedals and even post effects as well if you really want to reproduce the sounds of your heroes. But I would agree that the average guitarist is more likely to go and spend a bunch of money on equipment rather than actually fix the problems in the hands. Sure, you can have the gear as well, but gear is not going to fix crappy tone. And it's funny, you know, I've been teaching guitar for almost 20 years, and every single person that comes into my office and picks up a guitar sounds different. I don't know if it's the texture of their skin or the way they hold the pick or the way they strum the strings. Every single person has their own DNA. But the good thing about guitar is you can change your DNA very easily with practice. For me, practicing is largely about taking what you know and refining it until it sounds the way you want it to sound. And learning to adjust your finger pressure or learning to adjust your pick grip until it sounds the way you're hearing it in your head. And in the realm of guitar, we have so much variety. We've got thousands and thousands of wonderful players in our universe who all have slightly different ideas of how the guitar should sound when they're playing it. And so you get players like Eric Johnson who get this beautiful kind of purring violin tone out of the guitar. Or Nile Rodgers, who has a far more percussive, snappy, funky kind of vibe. And for me, both of those players have perfect tone, but they're completely different tones. They're kind of going off in different directions and achieving very different things. If you wanted to sound like either of those players, just worrying about the fingers is not quite enough. Both of those players have very distinct tones and philosophies behind those tones. And if you don't reproduce those, then you're probably going to struggle to get in the ballpark. Now, some of you out there are probably the people that comment on my videos that say, what's the point of copying? Why bother trying to replicate a great guitar player? Do something original. Well, what was the first song you started playing? It was probably Smoke on the Water or something like that. It was a song that already existed. Guitarists love learning things that already exist. It helps us improve, it helps us grow. And yes, sure, some idiots like me take it a bit further, and we get a huge amount of satisfaction and enjoyment from trying to reproduce the tones that we hear on our favorite albums and reproduce the playing as well. To feel like you're close to nailing the sound and the playing of one of your favorite players it's almost like finishing a puzzle or cracking a code. It's really enjoyable, and the best part is you can then take those skills and apply them elsewhere. You can apply them in your own music and your own playing. So on one side we have the tone is in the fingers, the playing side, and on the other side we have the equipment needed to sound like whoever you're trying to play like. Which do you think should come first? Now, the disciplinarian good boy approach would probably always say, get the playing sorted first. Get the fingers and the tone on the instrument sounding great and then start worrying about the gear. But lately, I've found the opposite is true. If you can try and reproduce the signal chain as accurately as possible of who you're trying to play like, then I find playing that song becomes a whole lot easier. It takes a lot of the weight off your shoulders. Imagine trying to get those huge dime bag tones with all of the squeals and the distortion, but you're using a classic Fender Strat through a Fender amp and a tube screamer. It's just not going to happen. A lot of those squeals and harmonics are just not going to come out at all on that single coil Fender Strat. And that's why in my 2 courses, Swedish Shred Secrets and Shred Like Ed, I give you the tone of those players before you start learning their licks. You can just download the preset, plug it in, and off you go. It'll make the playing side a lot easier because you're not having to work overtime to try and get those sounds to come out that just don't want to come out. Now, I think Eddie Van Halen was a great example of a player who had tone in the fingers. What I mean is he had a certain percussive thump with his right hand, and he had a strength in his left hand that helped notes sustain it. It sounded like he had more gain than he actually did. He had a unique way of maximizing tone from his instrument. But while EVH is a great example of how hands make a big difference to the tone, he's also a great example of how vital the gear is to achieve that tone. Eddie loved to tinker with his gear, and he did certain things to get magnificent tones out of that Marshall of his in the early days. Now, if you just try and play through a Fender practice amp without any of that information, then you're never going to sound like Eddie. Now, you might be saying, well, you don't sound like Eddie, Tom. Fair enough. But there are people out there who do a great job of getting close to sounding like Eddie, not just because they have the hands sorted, but because they've got the tone sorted. That neoclassical guy from Sweden is another great example of this. When I sat down and started learning to play like him a few years ago, I found it was so difficult because my tone just wasn't behaving. I had the naive mindset that if I just had some distortion, then I could sound like anybody else who has distortion. But the more research and fiddling I did, I realized that if you have a Plexi style amp and you're boosting it with a DoD 250 style pedal, then the way those two overdrives start cascading together creates that incredible Swedish shred tone. And I suddenly found it was so much easier to replicate those great economy picking runs and arpeggios if you had the right tone dialed in. But forever I'd naively had the approach of, well look, just get the hands sorted first and then worry about the tone later. I was watching this great Tim Pierce video the other day, and he talked about the incredible Neil Giraldo, guitar player for Pat Benatar, and he also played on Jesse's Girl. He played all the guitars on Jesse's Girl. And he said that whenever he jumped on Neil's guitar and had a go, the sound was completely different. Whenever Neil played it, it had more bass. There was just something special about the way he fretted the notes and the way he strummed the strings that brought out more bass from the instrument. Now, when I think of a player who doesn't have the tone in the fingers yet, I think of a player who maybe doesn't push the notes down hard enough, or whose playing doesn't sound intentional. Their playing might sound kind of vague. Like most of us on our first day of guitar lessons, we probably sound like kind of soulless and lifeless. Sure, you can say, well, look, that's a style, Tom. Great, whatever. But I know when I hear a player like Steve Lukather and I hear the way he's bending the note or vibrating the note, you can hear that there's decades and decades of practice and experience behind just that one note. And that gets me excited. And if you don't have the tone in the fingers yet, then it might sound more like, or who knows. It's all about developing that control. And I think the best way to develop that control is repetition. Take a small figure, something very small and simple, and loop it until it sounds the way you want it to. And if you already think it sounds good, then you should probably go and record yourself. Have a listen back and then go, ugh, okay, I'm not as good as I thought I was. And keep doing it until the recording sounds the way you want it to. And now if you really feel confident that you're playing it to the absolute best of your ability and you're kind of ringing every drop out of the guitar, then I recommend recording it and then using a software amp to tweak the tone. I use software amps for every single cover I create. And so my process usually is record the song, get a take that is acceptable, and then I listen back and then tweak the tone in post. This is why I love software amps like Amplitude, because it gives you complete control. You might decide, I hate this amp, I'll switch to a completely different amp. You can change all the effects, you can change just about anything. And I think the true beauty of using an amp modeler rather than an amp is you get to do that post-processing as well. Because if you want to sound like Joe Walsh in Hotel California, you're probably not going to get that sound out of an amp. It needs to go out of an amp into a microphone and then through a console where a bunch of effects, EQ and reverb and who knows what else is applied to really get that sound. But with software like Amplitude, I can just put those effects in after. And for once, I actually feel like I can get close to reproducing album sounds. And then when you go back and play the part again, man, it's so much easier because you're not having to work so hard to get those tones. But I do agree that having to work hard in the first place is good because it forces you to wring everything out of the instrument. So where does this leave you? Well, I recommend that when you go to learn to play like a certain player, one of the best things you can do is just start with their tone. Get your hands on a product like Amplitude, plug into your computer, and download some tones that sound like the person you're trying to play like. And then as you sit there working out how to play their songs and whatnot, you'll find it's far more intuitive. You're able to get those harmonics they're getting, or maybe you're able to get the percussive thump that they're getting. If you're trying to play Sultans of Swing and you don't have a compressor, then your guitar is going to sound thin and lifeless. And you're probably going to compensate by plucking too hard. And then when you try and do those fast arpeggios while plucking too hard, you're going to be tripping over yourself. So it really does have a knock-on effect. Being alive now while the internet is thriving is a great time for reproducing tones. Because if you want to know what someone was using, you can just Google it or watch some YouTube videos or download an Amplitude preset and then boom, it's right there. And you can look through the signal chain and go, that's the secret weapon. I think it's almost cheating in a way because many of us grew up at a time where you couldn't really do that. And you had to speculate for decades at a time how somebody got a certain tone. But now you can just go Google it, download it, and boom, you sound like insert Guitar Hero. But we can agree that you'll probably never sound exactly like your Guitar Hero because copying someone's DNA to that level is very, very difficult. But you can get very close. And you can definitely get close enough to be satisfied with. But at the end of the day, there are two parts to this equation. Yes, the gear is important and it does really help. But if you can't play with the same energy and intensity and intention, then you're not going to sound anything like the person you're imitating. So just do what I do. Get an app like Transcribe or something that allows you to slow music down and loop it. And just loop a tiny section, maybe even a 1-bar or a 2-bar section. Maybe it's a riff or a solo. And loop it until you sound exactly like what you hear. You do that enough and you'll take what's in their hands and start putting it in your hands. All right, shredders, let me know what you think. Am I a raving idiot? Are there some other things I've forgotten to say? Please let me know in the comments below. And thank you for watching and supporting my channel. And just another quick reminder about Swedish Shred Secrets and Shred Like Ed. If you want to learn to play like both of those guys and you want to start doing so without having to worry about finding the tone, then I've got it all covered for you. I'll even show you how to get close to those tones by using some pedals and a regular amp. All right, shredders. Thank you for watching. Do me a favor and check out one of these other videos.